registered participants, but now I think it's 44 and counting, coming from different time zones. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this webinar series organized by the Department of Architecture, Faculty of Civil Engineering and Planning, Universitas Islam Indonesia. I'm RAHARJO. I will be your host today, and I'm pleased to welcome our special guest speaker, Professor Kim DOVEY, who is in Melbourne at the moment. Good afternoon, Kim.
Good afternoon.
Let me briefly introduce Kim to you all. Kim DOVEY is a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Melbourne, where he is also the director of InfUr, the Informal Urbanism Research Hub. Kim is also former head of architecture and associate dean in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. He has published and broadcast widely on social issues in architecture, urban planning, and urban design and planning. His books include Framing Places, Fluid City, Becoming Places, Urban Design Thinking. I got the book here, Urban Design Thinking, and Mapping Urbanities. Kim currently leads research projects on urban morphology and informal settlements. Today, Kim is going to talk about his research on morphogenesis of informal settlements. If you read the abstract of his presentations, I guess he's looking at quote-unquote biological process of informal settlements development. For us who live in Indonesia and most countries in the global south, informal settlements is part of our everyday experience. So we tend to take it for granted. We often pay little attention to really understand how these settlements gradually develops and evolve over time, how the residents anticipate the threat and retrofit the built forms to stabilize the settlements. So I appreciate Kim's initiative in establishing and running the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at the University of Melbourne, and also his commitment in maintaining his interest on this subject for, I guess, more than 1 decade now. I'm not going to comment further on the content of his presentations. I will pass the screen to Kim, but before that, please allow me to explain the rundown of this event. Kim will do presentations for about 40 minutes. Then another 40 to 45 minutes will be allocated for responding to your questions. But please kindly write down your questions in the chat room, if possible, to make it easier for us to record. I guess that's all. Thank you very much. And Kim, the screen is yours.
Okay, and a very special thank you to Wing, who Wing was a long time ago was my PhD student, and Wing was probably the single person who was most responsible for introducing me to the challenges and the complexities and of practices and processes of informal settlement. And it's a special pleasure to be able to do this at DOVEY. Wing has invited me a couple of times to come to Yogyakarta again, which I still hope to do, but the pandemic has now put a bit of a dampener on international travel, and it's unclear now what the future of international travel is going to be like over the next couple of years. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you all very much for coming along. So many good friends across the Indonesian archipelago. You are our biggest and best neighbors. And so it's a special pleasure to be able to talk to you like this. It's interesting to me the way in which the pandemic has opened up the internet as a kind of a giant chat room. So I'll also look forward to some discussion when I'm finished the presentation. I'm going to go into sharing screen, so you'll see less of me and you'll see a lot of maps. Okay. So this is a project that I've done with some of my PhD students, Matthias van Oostrum, Ishita Chatterjee, and Tansel Shafiq. Matthias has graduated, and so they're in a sense equally responsible with this, and some of the work I'm also doing with another colleague, Alec Pafka. Just to say this is a kind of a team effort. I think that if we're to understand the way in which informal urbanism works, it's going to take quite a long time and quite a lot of teamwork. I know that the audience that I have here today won't be at all surprised about the pervasiveness of informal settlement as a mode of production globally. This project is trying to better understand the morphologies of informal settlement, and particularly using the kind of database that we now have from Google Earth over the last 20 years or so, to try and understand how informal settlements emerge, how they change, and what is in particular, what is the urban design and planning logic that lies beneath the practices of informal settlement. So keep going if I can. Some of this work is an attempt to go back and then to move forward from some of the very early insights about informal settlement, long before they were actually called informal settlements. The work of people like John Turner and so on back in the 1960s and 70s, who were arguing that what was happening here was a mode of production, and that this was producing the city. It was producing a permanent infrastructure of the city, and that if we understood it better and were able to harness informal production, then perhaps we could make some strides on producing better forms of urbanism and affordable housing for the urban poor. So this project is really trying to take that forward, trying to say that the insights there were not wrong, but they didn't go very far, because we very quickly moved into a different mode of trying to figure out how to replace informal settlements, and mostly equating the idea of informality and informal settlements with the idea of a slum. So this is a different paper indeed that is about that issue, but I should say I'm not here talking about slums. Slums or substandard urban outcomes are one of the possible results of this, and it's an important question to understand how that may or may not happen. For my purposes here, urban informality is defined not strictly as illegal, but as a mix of incremental, unauthorized, and self-organized. So trying to understand the processes that are involved here, and not simply to define it as the violation of a formal code. And the research approach that I'm using is what's often called an assemblage approach. And I don't want to turn this into a theory lecture, but this is a way of looking at the city that tries to understand it as a set of relations that operate in multiple scales, at every scale from the laneway and streetscape up to the global geopolitical context, and tries to understand the way in which the city evolves and changes through practices of mapping. I won't say any more about the theory than that, but I'm happy to answer questions if anyone wants, or to talk about the methodology if anyone wants to in the discussion period. The method here uses Google data, Google Street View, and Google Earth. And the database, the diachronic database that has been produced of aerial photographs over time that only goes back to about 2000. So we're only looking at contemporary informal settlements, only those that have been designed and planned and settled over the last 20 years or so. And we're really looking for the informal rules or logic that underlie the production of the informal city. We're trying to understand this form of production as a kind of upgrading of vacant land or water or escarpment or whatever it happens to be into affordable housing, and acknowledging that this can produce the kind of substandard neighborhoods that we often label the slum, but really trying to go beyond simply equating these places as with slums, which generally leads to the idea that they need to be replaced, and instead to understanding them so that we might be able to better engage with communities of the urban poor in upgrading and in harnessing the practices of upgrading that they are already engaged in, and also in anticipating what might happen next. I'm going to look at 5 case studies. So this is a project that at the moment has 50 case studies. The larger project is an informal settlement atlas, where we acknowledge that we're not looking in depth. Calling them cases is a little bit pretentious, because we are not able to do the kind of detailed case study research that would be necessary to tell the whole story in each case. We're trying to get a global spread, which means it's a fairly shallow kind of a study in that sense. And we're really only looking at certain parts of each settlement. We acknowledge that every settlement is different, and every settlement has a different political, economic, and other kinds of context, and can be explained in different ways. But we're interested in the patterns, the similarities, and the differences globally. And we're not only interested in the poorest of settlements, we're interested in middle-class informality as well, acknowledging that this is not always an issue of poverty. I said we have 50. We're not finished the 50, but the paper that this is based on explores 5 of these cases and uses that as a basis to draw some conclusions about what we're seeing, and I'll present them later. But those 5 cases are in settlements from Manila, Buenos Aires, Lima, Nairobi, and Cairo. And for the purposes of this audience, I've added one more case, which is in Jakarta. So we'll come to that. So there'll be 6. And I'm going to go through them very, very fast. I need to go through them fast because I really want to not draw lessons about each particular case, but about the interrelations between them and the common patterns and differences between them, as I said before. And I'm going to start in Manila, not so far from Indonesia. This is a settlement called the Seiko. This is a large settlement of over 50 hectares in total that's located on the harbour's edge in Manila, where it's now home to, depending on who you listen to, around 450,000 people. The land along 2 large breakwaters was originally settled by port workers and fishermen. This is 2003. And from about 2002 onwards, this stretch of water behind the breakwaters was gradually reclaimed and the area was settled. A relatively formal housing scheme, a site and services scheme, you can see on the edge on the right, was laid out in a grid pattern, and some of these streets were extended and the remainder developed in a highly informal morphology. The primary increment of encroachment was single rooms without plots. The earliest constructions appeared on the higher ground, avoiding the marshy areas and the drainage alignments. While minor access routes are not reliably detectable in this database, the primary access routes through the settlement were apparent by 2005 and had stabilised by 2007. While many of the major streets were originally drainage canals, this is a morphogenic process where the architecture mostly comes first, with the smaller laneway network emerging over time as a set of paths between buildings. The major access routes were at first very wide and became encroached over time, but only to a limit of about 4.5 metres, respecting rights of way for vehicles. New development emerged in distributed but relatively intensive clusters across the site, with the edges of main streets and the marshy areas becoming further encroached over time. Just a little explanation on these maps. They're trying to show the morphogenic process in each image, with the older images being in red and the newer ones being in orange. And something similar happening on the access networks. The building grain here is typically single room increments that can extend by accretion to about 12 metres in length. The buildings are often constructed in temporary materials that are later upgraded to concrete and cement block, along with small adaptations of the access network. By 2017, the settlement exhibited a saturation of building intensity and second stories were being added. The smallest laneways here are largely obscured by the overhangs and the ambiguities between private space and public access. Street view reveals entrances to a microscale network that could only be revealed by a more detailed study. That was the first case. The second one, we're moving to Latin America, where it's going to move very fast. Here we start at 2000. This is a settlement called Zavaleta. It's on a 12-hectare site of post-industrial and derelict land, about 5 kilometres from central Buenos Aires. The site is divided into eastern and western sections by an old rail line and framed by a range of informal, mixed and formal developments. The western side was initially rapidly encroached in 2001 and 2, which was a period of severe economic crisis and civil unrest in Argentina. It then filled out to about 80% coverage by 2005. A series of lanes about 4 to 5 metres wide, largely aligned with the existing formal development to the south, and extend north until they were blocked by a low ridge. So you see different impacts of topography, but also of the formal city. North of this ridge, a more informal network emerged in this area. That's this one. The scale of these broader lanes matches those that characterize the surrounding street network and allow for cars to both access and to park. In the eastern section, which was initially encroached, it's over here, was initially encroached from 2006 to 8. The existing railway line, where trains still run, has been adapted as part of the laneway network. The main laneway morphology was established during the initial occupation, after which intensification occurred. Where car access has been established, then at least a 3-metre right-of-way has been preserved. Pedestrian lanes are at least 1 metre wide. While building alignments may be wider, interface elements such as porches, stairs, and so on often encroach, but not beyond these limits, allowing a right-of-way. Upper floors regularly cantilever over the public space by a ½ metre for either a larger upper floor or for a balcony. The smaller lanes exhibit a different morphogenic process with a shorter time cycle and are subject to different forces than the larger streets. They often emerge later in the development process to provide access to rear properties and may be periodically gated. A track across vacant land may become established as a right-of-way over time, yet our maps show that small laneways are also more likely to become blocked as settlement intensifies. The laneway width is a critical factor since it mediates the penetration of cars and the capacities for social life and informal production. Laneways below about 2 meters wide are largely reduced to access functions and may become tunnels when the buildings or one or both sides are cantilevered above. Evidence from the street view data of this settlement suggests that laneways over 2 meters wide often have a social character with a relatively active interface. The third case I want to talk about here is an escarpment from Lima in Peru, called El Sauce. It's located about 7 kilometers from the city center of Lima on an escarpment above a pre-existing cemetery. The earliest photograph in 2002 shows a small informal grid of housing in the flattest part of the valley. The access network that then unfolds from 2003 is semi-organized and comprised of 2 distinct path or road types. The first is a series of vehicular roads about 7 meters wide, initially along the valley floor, and then up the escarpments via a series of zigzag roads with hairpin turns. The second is a series of lanes about 3 meters wide that initially form into these combs and fishbone formations as laterals off the main road. These lanes are roughly straight and aligned directly up or down the slope at intervals of about 30 meters. That interval. The spacing of the laterals is geared to a plot size of about 10 by 15 meters. So where the first 2 cases didn't have plots, here there is a plot and then the buildings are constructed on the plot. What emerges is a distorted grid. Here we are in 2018. What emerges is a distorted grid with steeper slopes producing a smaller block because distance between switchbacks is shorter. These street and lane patterns are marked out on the hillside in advance of construction. Buildings emerge as soon as vehicular access is established and laneways emerge later. The most common buildings are linear 2 to 3 room houses constructed 1 room at a time along the contour. Semi-organized encroachment of this kind on very steep terrain has a long tradition in Lima. Satellite data shows that the main access roads are planned and reserved before being constructed in increments of a few hundred meters at a time, opening up a few hectares for each new development. By 2018, the entire settlement here covered 90 hectares, which was built over a 15-year period at a regular pace of about 5 hectares per year. There are now shops emerging on the main roads. The fourth case here is called Baraka, and it's in Nairobi. It's a 16-hectare settlement about 10 kilometers east of central Nairobi, which developed from about 2003 on former quarry land. Most of it is on former quarry land. The first stage of settlement in the northeastern part of the site was informally planned in a comb formation, this kind of formation, with plots of about 8 by 16 meters, forming blocks of two plots thick, with 8 to 10 meter streets. So this is a semi-organized settlement. The organization of the street network only became apparent over time as the plots were built out and the temporary paths and tracks were erased. The plot sizes, the block formations and street widths have morphological similarities to the pre-existing formal and informal settlements of surrounding neighborhoods. So there's an anticipatory process going on here. The more uneven quarry land to the west developed later and less formally than the northeast part, following a main access track as a spine from which laterals emerged. The topography of the quarry provided a challenge, and a more irregular street network adapted to buildings and territorial claims as much as the buildings followed the streets and plots. Dead-end streets were often the first phase of a process that ultimately connects back to form a rough grid. The later streets and lanes are generally less regular and narrower than the early ones, but can become straightened and widened over time. The most common building typology is a row of 2 rooms constructed along half of the plot, and then the other half is added later to form a double-loaded corridor, often used for rental, commonly used for rental accommodation in this part of Africa. These buildings often develop to full plot coverage, meaning 100% coverage, and up to 4 stories high, leaving most rooms without natural light and ventilation. Street view also shows many other building types, including single room housing, schools, shops, and religious compounds. This example is typical of informal settlement patterns that represent a major form of urban development on the outskirts of many sub-Saharan African cities. We keep this little cook's tour of the globe going to Cairo, in a site called Baraka on the outskirts of Cairo, which has developed since about 2000, with an urban morphology that's strongly aligned with the pre-existing agricultural infrastructure and land parcels. The thin fields here that vary from about 15 to 25 meters wide have become the primary increments of development as they're progressively subdivided into 20-meter wide blocks with 4 to 6 meter streets between them. The aerial images suggest a complex set of relations between field and plot size. While the blocks are clearly aligned with the original fields, they're not entirely congruent. Some streets are the original field boundaries and some are not. Each block is formed of back-to-back plots of about 10 by 12 meters that are developed primarily into apartment buildings with very high coverage, often 100%. Each linear block may take as much as 8 years to fully develop, producing a highly impermeable urban fabric. While initially access from one lane to the next is enabled by vacant lots, access is blocked once coverage is complete, and some lanes extend to over 700 meters without cross streets. The apartment buildings are constructed 1 floor at a time to an average height of about 6 stories, but some continue up to 12 stories. Here we are at 2017. This area is largely completed. Buildings are often cantilevered over the street, reducing the width at upper levels to about 3 to 4 meters between buildings. This pattern of urbanization is characteristic of large parts of Cairo, and it produces a very high residential densities and negligible open space. This is the most organized of our examples and is produced in part by family enterprises geared to income flows from jobs in the Gulf states. The younger people in the family go away, earn the money, send it back. Other members of the family are building, and the apartment building may be partly rental, but will be also used by different parts of the same family. Where there is research available on these different sites, we have used that as well, meaning other people's research, which is the case in Cairo. Wonderful book by David Sims. I said I would throw in one of our Jakarta examples. There's an awful lot of the informal development in and around Indonesian cities happened in the last century, and so it's not easy to find too many examples where there's a good database. This is one called Muara Angke, which is on the port side of northern Jakarta. It's an estuary about 12 kilometers from the central city where the Ciliwung River empties into the sea. In 2003, the site was largely used for aquaculture, an informal patchwork of ponds that averaged about 2 hectares each, with small walkways between. By 2004, it's only a year later, houses were beginning to emerge on reclaimed land adjacent to these walkways. Settlement was also appearing along the coast and the adjacent river, where fishing boats and jetties were becoming evident. By 2009, new land had been created with formal infill along the coastal strip. So this was formally filled. And a 10-metre wide formal roadway, this one, was constructed through the settlement, demolishing some buildings and providing access to the port facility that was under construction. At this stage, most of the water ponds had been filled and settled, with the former walkways becoming major laneways, except where the new formal road sliced through. That was never a walkway. The single remaining pond was converted to a small harbour by cutting through the adjacent river. The river was lined with boats, and several of the more formal ponds had been filled and converted to fish drying yards. Development since 2009 has largely comprised consolidation and encroachment onto formerly infilled land. Some of the port infrastructure emerged along the new waterfront, where it coexisted for a while with the informal settlement, but was soon demolished and then replaced with more informal development. The street and laneway network maps, there we are, 2018. Different kind of mapping happening here. The street and laneway maps show that with the exception of the big formal street, the morphology was largely driven by the network of paths established by the pre-existing agriculture. The extent of settlement maps show a relatively consistent expansion until 2009, with consolidation and smaller encroachments thereafter. So that's 2013 and 2018. Here we see a production of land on two fronts. The agricultural ponds were filled in incrementally for informal housing, while the coastline was also filled formally, initially for port facilities, before then being claimed for more informality. This is a very mixed settlement. It's a mix of building increment sizes from single rooms to larger buildings. It's a mix of very makeshift and highly durable architecture, and a mix of functions with a high level of industry, mostly fishing industry, mixed with the housing. There are 2 mosques, but no public buildings. This is street view, goes pretty much through this. This community is now well and truly settled with embedded livelihoods, and this urban design, while it needs to be better connected, has become what I would argue is a permanent part of Jakarta. This is a key to some of the things we've been trying to do through this project. That's presenting the 6 cases. One of the key things is to try and understand that these settlements, with a few exceptions, are permanent parts of the city. Our children and our children's children will inherit these as parts of the city. They will be inevitably incorporated into the planning schemes of the formal city. And the big challenge and the main reason for wanting to do this research is to build a better knowledge base for that ongoing challenge of incorporating these in. How are we going for time? I think we're good. Okay, I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about what it is that we might conclude from this. So in a sense, if that's the field work, the first thing I wanted to do is to locate this. This is some earlier work I did with another colleague, Hesam Kamalapur. It's also published. This work is mostly published now, where we were asking, what are the different kinds of urban informality if we're not going to simply treat informal settlement as one thing, as if it were all similar? What are the different morphologies? How might we do this? And we had originally sketched this kind of field where different forms of informality could be categorized according to whether it was the urban design or the architecture that was the most formal. In the lower left corner, where both the urban design and the architecture is fully informal, we get the kind of almost archetypal informal settlement. And when both the urban design and the architecture is formal, we get the most formal. But in between are a whole lot of mixed categories. And we were trying to locate different settlements along those lines. And this is roughly where the settlements that we have looked at lie on this. We took a trajectory from Seiko in Manila through from the most informal through Zavaleta in Buenos Aires, El Sauce in Lima, Baraka in Nairobi, Al Barakail in Cairo, becoming progressively more formal, but trying to make the point that this is not some simple continuum, that sometimes it's the urban design that is becomes mixed or semi-formal. Sometimes it's the architecture that becomes mixed, as it is indeed at Wairangi. That's just to locate where these settlements were, and I want now to draw a few rather tentative conclusions. So this is really first steps. So I know that a lot of you will have a great deal more experience than I do, particularly with the settlements that you might have been engaged with in Indonesia. And some of these comments might sound wrong in relation to particular settlements. You know, this is a discussion that I would look forward to. This is not me trying to present a final conclusion, rather to present some understandings that come out of a much larger range of cases than these, and are based on the way in which these settlements are developing over the last 20 years. The first is a few comments on topography. It's reasonably clear, and this is true for formal settlements as well as informal, that the morphology of settlement responds to the topography. On land of relatively marginal utility and access, such as waterfronts and escarpments, where we find so many informal settlements, the most accessible, flattest and stable sites are developed first. That's a fairly obvious point in many ways. And the existing infrastructure, such as it exists, tracks, existing roads, field boundaries, drains and so on, are very often adapted and extended. So you can often read the way in which the site has been used before in the forms of settlement that emerge. Even if a track across an open field was relatively arbitrary, as this one here in Buenos Aires, it was just a track. It became de facto the main street of the new settlement. I'm going to go through these quite fast. It's very hard to generalize, but the forms of informal settlement, issues of tenure, which we have not studied here, but except in a very shallow way. It's almost like the elephant in the room with so many informal settlements, because gaining secure tenure is the big project in the minds of so many people who live in informal settlements. And it's hard to generalize, but it is certainly very different on public versus private land. The first three of these are on public land, and the last two are on private land. And there's a bit of a difference between the way in which settlement happens. On public land, it is often conceived as a kind of an invasion, whereas on private land, it is often the case that the private owners invite or sell certain informal rights to settle. And so it is not really a kind of an invasion, and it's often called a kind of piracy, in the sense that it operates outside formal authorization, but it operates with the authorization of the landowner. On public land, you get what we call de facto tenure, and that develops over time. And the investment in the housing and the infrastructure tends to reinforce this de facto tenure. The longer the settlement remains. These are lessons that come from the literature as much as anything. and that the kind of anticipatory urban design that we saw in some of these cases, where the street and block size replicates that which is found in the surrounding formal city, can be understood as a kind of anticipatory urban design, which increases de facto tenure. The more the informal settlement resembles, looks like, is congruent with the formal city, the more likely it is to gain formal tenure, at least in the minds of the residents. Our evidence here is limited to saying that this replicating of the formal context is relatively common, especially in the more formal of the settlements, not so much in the very rapid encroachments such as the first case that we saw here. And on private land, development rights are often purchased informally, and the levels of tenure security are relatively higher. And one outcome here that we find anyway is that the process is slower, that when residents feel that they don't need to do things rapidly in order to establish de facto tenure. We asked a few questions about the size of increments, which range here. We often think of the archetypal informal settlement as a room by room accretion, built one room at a time by the urban poor, because that's the only way in which resources flow, that indeed much less than a room, sometimes half of a room is the most that can be afforded at one time. What we find across these settlements is that the increment size varies enormously. The larger increments obviously require more organisation and resources, so the more organised settlements have larger increments. The increment size is one of the ways in which, of course, informal settlement is defined, that these are identified on Google Earth in part because of their irregularity and incrementality. So that when I mean, a lot of people would look at the Cairo example and say it's not an informal settlement because it looks so regular, but it operates certainly in this unauthorized way. So the increment sizes increase over time as settlements become more organized, and this is usually because they also gain more resources and are able to build larger increments over time. And the irregularity that emerges in the early phase is often straightened in later phase as buildings are upgraded. The kind of the highly irregular morphology produced in that early phase may be upgraded to be straightened out, with streets widened and streets straightened, partly in anticipation of a formalization process. There's a very important issue about the relationship between buildings and plots. In the most informal settlements, buildings effectively become plots. Most of the Western literature on urban morphology and the way cities develop posit the idea of a plot as one of the basic elements: the plot, the street, the building, and buildings and plots are seen as different. In the most informal of settlements, the building becomes the plot. The building establishes the claim over the plot, and the plots may indeed be added to around a building after the event. As settlements become more organized, they start to develop plots. So in the particular trajectory that I took you through with these 5 cases, the first 2 cases, the building is simply built and becomes the plot. From the one in Lima onwards, they were all plots within which buildings are built. So there's a different kind of relationship between architecture and urban design that emerges in informal settlements. Okay, and they basically co-evolve. Buildings in the most informal of settlements, buildings attached to existing roads, but then roads also emerge between buildings. So there's this co-evolution process. In the formal city, the urban design, the plan, is nearly always laid down first, and the architecture is then added within that framework and is contained by that framework. That begins to emerge in the more organized of these examples, but in the most informal of them, there is this co-evolutionary process. And indeed, it's a process whereby buildings attached to streets and then lateral streets emerge between the buildings along the street. Those laterals are then extended, and then further laterals connect back to form a kind of a distorted grid. This is a very common pattern in the more informal of the settlements. This, by the way, seems to me to be one reason why we have to develop this kind of knowledge in our architecture and planning and urban design schools, because informal urban design, which is what this is a very different process to the kind that is mostly taught, almost exclusively taught. A few comments about public space. Informal rights of way protect access. So informal rights of way are simply the things that we take for granted most of the time, that the access to our houses will be protected through a public street network. In informal settlements, this emerges informally. And although minor lanes may be blocked or adapted, by and large, these rights of way are informally protected. Pedestrian rights of way are generally at least 1 metre wide. Car access is at least 3 metres wide, but usually wider 4 to 5. Interface elements often encroach on these rights of way and can work, ironically, to produce and protect a vibrant social life. Very often when households spill their domestic space and domestic production into the laneway, this slows down the cars and the traffic. And open space is rarely produced by an informal process. It's one of the key problems of this situation. I showed you this slide before. I show it again to make a point that the upgrading that all the informal settlement processes are practices of upgrading. The informal settlements may indeed overdevelop and develop into slum conditions, but they can also develop in different ways. One of these photographs is actually of a Greek island. I'm sure you can now pick it, where you can pay $100 a night for a hotel room. You know, that the informal process and what's attracting people in that occasion is not slum tourism. It's the character, the urban character of the informal development process. So there's something about this informal logic of informal settlement that is, it has some fundamental connection to the way in which cities develop. All cities develop, not just the informal settlements. So there are many kinds of informal settlements. Just to wrap up, it's very common to know and to understand that informal settlements are produced by larger global geopolitical forces. Neoliberal capitalism, I'm not the exception to this. That's my critique of why this is going on. But to understand that is the case is not the same as to know how informal settlements are produced. Informal settlements are major assets of the urban poor. They own this infrastructure because they built it, and they own the houses. And these settlements cannot be demolished, by and large cannot be demolished without damaging the livelihoods of the urban poor. The big challenge here, the challenge often called co-production, requires working with the urban poor, and it requires knowing more about the self-organized architecture, the urban design, and the planning that is there. I'm going to skip that because I'm a bit out of time and go straight to the That's the reference. This paper is not yet published, but it is in press. It will be out within the next couple of months, I think, in Habitat International. And now we could have some discussion, Wing.
Thank you, Kim. Let's give a virtual applause to Kim. All right. There's a couple of questions here. I'm not going to read all of them, but can you see the chat, the question in the chat room? The first one is from Santi Paula. Well, it's about, there's 4 questions already here. So I hope So
do you want me to just take them?
Yeah, I think I will start with the first questions from Santi. Informal settlements is part of informal space. Can you give comments related to informal space, particularly related to the relation between formal and informal space? The arrangements of informal space certainly different from formal space. Sometimes the arrangements of informal space, I'm not quite sure about this, but it's writing about arrangement of informal space in a formal way. So what do you think about this phenomenon?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I'll have a go. You start by saying informal settlement is a part of informal space. I'm not entirely sure how to read that, but if it means that the idea of the informal city is something much larger than just informal settlement, then I agree with that. One of the ways that I have of trying to understand informal urbanism, I would say, my way of putting it would be to say that informal settlement is one key dimension of informal urbanism. And that informal urbanism, I would define as, if you like, it's a very hard thing to define. That's another paper entirely. But the easy way of understanding it is that the highly informalized cities of the global south and Indonesia has many such cities, are characterized by 3 primary forms of urban informality, and settlement is one of the 3, and the other 2 are informal street vending and informal transport, which I would then define as the informal public transport, the way in which informality, in Indonesia, it's very often sort of motorcycle taxis, which have become semi-formalized, of course. And then informal street vending, which is, of course, one of the key livelihoods of the urban poor, particularly in early phases when they first come to the city. If that's the part of what the question is trying to get at, I would say that the larger city, that phrases like the informal city and the formal city and informal space and formal space seem to me to lead to the idea that somehow these are different spaces, when most of the time formality and informality intersect in the same space. This doesn't mean that it is some kind of semi-formal condition. It means that highly formal rules and highly informal practices coexist in the same space at the same time, and that it is these intersections and these negotiations that go on between informal adaptation and the formal framework that become so interesting. Now, one comment I would make is that this is not different to what happens in any other city of the world, including my own city, Melbourne. My own view is that good cities are always this mix of formal and informal processes. My best way of trying to exemplify this is to say that the most pervasive and effective form of informal transport is called walking. you know, when we walk, we are mostly not following rules. Well, we're following informal codes, and these informal codes are what prevent us from bumping into each other. They don't prevent us from crossing, even when there are formal rules about not crossing roads or whatever. Those codes generally don't work. If there's enough people, you tend to get across the road. You would know what this is like. If you can find 5 other people who are willing to break the code with you, then you're likely to get away with it. So walking is a very highly informalized aspect of the city, and cities cannot work without that. So in my view, all cities are a mix of formal and informal, and the informal is fundamentally important, as is the formal, to making those cities work. And what we need to do is to get a better understanding of how they work together. And very often they do work together. Some cities are over-formalized. If the state comes in and tries to control public life too much, they kill urban life. Urbanity itself is highly dependent on informality. I'll leave that as an answer to that question for now. Shall we just go down the list, Wing? Or
yeah, the second one is from Prof. Heru Porbo. How did you identify the relationships between the informal settlements pattern and the other data, contributing factors, context, policy, history, topography, etc., that govern the pattern?
Okay, our cases are relatively shallow. We're dealing with a very particular set of data, in as much as, and we have gravitated to those cases where we can get access to that data through Google Earth and Street View to some degree. In many cases, we have done web searches, we have scoured the net to see what we can learn about each case, but we have not been able to visit each case, and we have not been able to do the kind of case studies that would elaborate the historical, the political and other aspects. So we tend to focus on topography and morphology. So this is not to exclude the importance of the other things, and we acknowledge, and indeed often want to point to how important they will be, but we are reluctant to have the idea of informal settlement reduced to some larger scale contextual issue. It's our view that the morphological similarities globally are enough to want to understand this formal logic of informality. This is often, what I often call the forms of informality, that there is a formal logic that's going on here. And if we want to get a grip on the future of these settlements and work with the residents of these communities to develop a livable urban future, because the overwhelming majority of these settlements are permanent and will become livable. They will become as livable as the medieval remnants of European cities that are now such tourist attractions. So we can't do the context. We can't do a full case study on each of these. I've got to say that each of the PhD students I'm working with are doing such case studies, and they're publishing them. Okay, so that work will come out. But a detailed case study is like a PhD. And if we were to do a PhD on each of these settlements, we would never have this kind of comparative study. You do one or the other. This is a global comparison. So the question, how did we identify the relationship between the settlement pattern and the other data? We took what data we had, we drew what inferences we can, but we also leave with a warning that this is not the end of the story for each of these cases. This is a comparative study. The next one says, you have mentioned that urban design is to mediate desire to better future. My question is about urban design professional that has a different habitus, maybe desire with the people who live and build informal settlement. How to bring knowledge of informal morphogenesis into formally an industrialized urban design profession. Oh dear, you want a lot there, don't you? This will be a slow process. As I said, the informal urban design is a very different process. It doesn't, firstly, it doesn't really have an author. It has a kind of shared authorship over time where collective decisions are made or simply emerge. This often happens really quite fast. In many settlements, we can identify a period when the key urban design decisions were made. That's why I like to call this an urban design process. That it's often portrayed that as if this were somehow an organic, natural thing. It just kind of happened like a tree falling over in the wilderness or something. These are intentional decisions. Large amounts of resources are invested in designing, shaping, and building the infrastructure of these settlements. And this is why I say this is a major asset of the urban poor. In many cases, these communities are doing the job of the state. These settlements very often emerge under conditions of a relatively weak and impoverished state. And this is, in a sense, what the state would normally be doing. And in this case, you've simply got communities building their own infrastructure. And when the state comes in and takes over that infrastructure, if you like, formalizes it, they have to acknowledge that there's a huge capital investment already there, and that is owned by the people who designed and built it. I'm wandering off the question, which was how do we change the urban design profession? So this is, how do we change the planning profession? How do we change the architecture profession? These things change slowly. My goal is simply to show how this works so that emerging professionals will have the knowledge that they need to be able to engage. For the most part, we now have 50 years of history of Western, mostly Western, but even indigenous urban design consultants and professionals coming in and saying, this is an informal settlement. What it needs is it needs to be formalized. So all of those streets need to be straightened. And since some of them or most of them are substandard, why don't we just demolish the lot and then lay down a street grid that looks like the suburbs of Melbourne or whatever. There's 50 years of experience of this not working. But more to the point, it actually destroys livelihoods. And so that getting our mind out of that and learning how to work with the processes of informal design and production is the way forward. Having professionals understand that, I think, is important. I think too often professionals think that the answer is to back off, that, okay, these people don't need architects, and I'm an architect, therefore I'll go away and build more houses for wealthy corporations and rich people, and leave them to themselves because they're, that's what an informal process does. I'm not of that view. I think that the best professional help that we can give is going to be necessary in order to incorporate the huge mass. This is over between 1 and 2 billion people live in informal settlements of this kind. That they need major infrastructure. They particularly need highly skilled design in terms of open space and street connectivity and street width, the informal codes that are already in place but are sometimes not working, where the overdevelopment of cantilevers leads to the entunneling of streets and public spaces. This needs to be stopped, not by going in and demolishing and imposing a different order on those communities, but by working with those communities. Nobody wants to live in substandard conditions. So that there is a need for professionals to work with people, but there's also a need for the kind of spatial and design skills that architects and urban designers are trained in. These skills are needed. High quality design is needed in the engagement with informal settlements. And high quality planning too also means something other than just coming up with another plan or another formal regulation. It needs that this is a form of planning, it is a form of architecture, it is a form of urban design. I can't say much more than that right now.
The next one is from Indang Triningsih.
Okay, so this says, thank you so much for sharing your current research interest appears as being a process of establishing new places of urban settlement. Is there any form of maturity to the established acquired space? I would like to assume that it would eventually be formalized and trimmed down due to limited capacity of land ownership. Thank you. I don't know what trimmed down means, but the first part of the question is a good question. It's interesting. Is there any form of maturity that we might expect here? One of the things that we find, some of the most interesting work to me is the work of Besim Hakim, who wrote this book called Mediterranean Urbanism, which is really about the morphogenesis of Mediterranean villages, the kind that are now so popular among tourists. And that's in part because they did reach a maturity where a set of informal rules did control for overdevelopment. They didn't overdevelop. So informal urban design, in a sense, can work. I'd like to think that's kind of maturity that is possible. Under conditions of poverty, it's much more common, however, for overdevelopment to take place, and where some version of the tragedy of the commons occurs, where the individual benefit from encroaching a little bit more on public space or a little bit more over public space takes the place of the quality of the urban design, and trying to find some kind of a plateau is important. In the formal city, we're trained in universities to come up with finished plans, that the crit at the end of the semester is what will this perfect outcome look like, and then we can decide whether it's good and what kind of a mark the student gets for this finished product. I think we have to change our way of thinking. That's by the way, the book that Wing held up, the Urban Design Thinking book, is really about trying to change the way we think about urban design, not trying to tell people what kind of urban design should be done, but to change and to induce a different kind of thinking about things. And I feel the same about informal settlements. I don't think that there would be any point at which you would say that the settlement is finished, but I think that there is a point at which you can say that it reaches a kind of maturity. Many of the development processes continue by room accretion until they reach about 3 to 4 stories, and that reaches a kind of a natural limit, in part because these buildings are not organized around common lift wells and staircases, and so the internal access routes and reach that kind of natural limit. That's one kind of maturity that does get reached in some settlements. Other times, the overdevelopment occurs to such a degree that you really do have to consider some forms of demolition and replacement in order to upgrade the settlement. So it's not, there's no easy answer to this. I don't think that, and I also think, by the way, that good cities are different cities. Not every city should be the same, not every neighborhood should be the same. So that there is no way that I would be thinking, let's come up with an ideal way in which an informal settlement should be, and then let's impose it blanket-like across the globe. That's not the way that informal settlements are creative, they are innovative, they are adaptive, they're agile, and they will adapt to the opportunities that emerge, and those opportunities will be in relation to the local governance regimes as much as in relation to the local topography. But they are primarily economic in the sense that informal settlements are where they are because that is where that housing enables those residents to get access to the economic opportunities that will enable them to move forward. This whole process is driven by an economy of rural to urban migration. These people are migrating to cities because it is in their interest to do so, and they're putting down, they're gaining a foothold in the city through this production of affordable housing. They are, in many cases, producing land out of water or producing usable land out of otherwise unused land. They are doing a service, in a sense, for the state by building the infrastructure that the state can't build. There needs to be a lot of respect for the kind of contribution that informal settlements have made to the larger scale development. If anyone looks at informal settlements and says, okay, we just need to get rid of them, and then we could adopt this modernist dream of the image of the global capitalist city, then they are in la-la land. The informal settlements and those communities, they run the city. The city collapses without these settlements. That was in relation to the maturity question. I think I ventured off that topic again. The next one says...
Many other questions.
There's another one here, says the informal sector has been constant.
There's another one before that. How to solve informal settlements increase damage, especially in Jakarta city.
How to solve informal settlement increased damage, especially in Jakarta city. What seems to be behind that is the assumption that the informal settlements are damaging the city. What I know of Jakarta, and I've done one project only really in Jakarta, there's a paper that came out last year on some of the settlements along the Ciliwung. One of the things I learned in doing that project was that a lot of people blame informal settlements in Jakarta for causing flooding. This is a view that has doesn't appear to have very much evidence at all. There are a very large number of things that cause flooding in Jakarta, including having built a city of that size on effectively a floodplain, concreting very large parts of it for the formal city and increasing the runoff, producing flooding, allowing the rivers to clog up with all kinds of silt and other things. There's many reasons why that the flooding occurs there, and informal settlements is a very minor piece of that in my understanding of that evidence. I'm not sure what other kind of damage is being talked about in Jakarta. A lot of people feel that informal settlements damage the image of the city, and I understand that. I think we all want a beautiful city. I think we all want a green city, but I'm not sure whether we really want to see the livelihoods of the urban poor damaged in order to get that. The best way, if the damage is about the damage to the image or even the global brand of Jakarta, I would say the best way to solve that is to invest in the upgrading of the settlements so that the image changes. One of the interesting things is that in the Indonesian context, the idea of the kampung and the informal settlement overlap, and in some cases I think are become a little bit synonymous. The kampung, of course, means village, but it has other connotations as well. I don't know how far to go down this track other than to say that the idea of traditional Indonesian life is based in the kampung. Many aspects of the kampung are highly attractive, and indeed highly attractive to global tourism. In many cases, cities that are desperate to get rid of all of the informal trading and the informal settlements may get rid of many of the aspects of their cities that are not only highly valuable to them, but quite attractive to global tourism. That question would have to be elaborated a bit more for me to answer it any differently than that, I think. The next one says the informal sector is either an informal settlement of informal business, has been constantly scapegoated for many urban problems like floods, fire, environmental degradation, visual disturbance, crime. It appears strikingly in most big cities in Indonesia that urban poor is illegalized and criminalized for being an informal part of the urban fabric. Hence, eviction seems to be the fast and easy way to fix the problem. In your opinion, how do we get to the middle ground between formal and informal sector in terms of regulation? To what extent should we appreciate the development of the informal, as we cannot just take for granted the encroachment of the informal, as if all informal development is allowable and justifiable? Thanks. Okay, I think I've answered parts of that question, and I'll have a go at perhaps the parts that I haven't addressed. Yes, I'm not of the view that all informal development is necessarily good or should be permitted by the state or anything like that. I think it's a big issue. The biggest problems to me of informal settlement have to do with the production of a kind of substandard urbanism. I prefer not to use the word slum because I think it's a slur word that casts a stigma on not only the form of the settlement, but also on the inhabitants of the settlement. What we have, and the problem that I think should be engaged with, is the idea of standards, because that is why the state is where it is. You know, I think we need to ask, why do we need a state? States are not natural. States are there for a purpose. There is a social contract. This goes all the way back to the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. There is a social contract between citizens and the state, where the state protects us from a life, as he put it, which is nasty, brutish, and short. So that the state is there to protect its citizens. And in as much as it does this, then citizens have an obligation then to follow the rules and regulations that are put down by the state. But in many cases, if the state is unable to protect against poverty, then there is also a right to the city and a right to, if you like, to occupy and to develop informal settlements as a means of gaining a foothold in the city. And that right needs to be respected. So the middle ground that this question is referring to, I would say, is about trying to operate with empathy and understand that these settlements don't emerge out of some kind of simple opportunism. These are effects of deep inequalities in our society. And if we are going to accept those inequalities, we have to accept that this is one of the results that comes from those. I don't think that means we accept the substandard nature of these neighborhoods at all. I think that anyone who practices in architecture, in urban design, in urban planning, wants a city where there is equity and where there are standards, where there are standards of plumbing, where there are bathrooms, where there are space standards, where buildings don't fall down in an earthquake, where there are open spaces for our kids to play. We have to get much more serious about what those standards mean and how we can bring the expertise of our professions to upgrade these settlements to a standard that we would be willing to live in and to have our children raised in. There's no easy answer to this question. Certainly, I agree with the questioner that the problem cannot be fixed through erasure and replacement unless that replacement is very well funded and is in a similar location. And that is so rarely the case. So often it is the cheapest and nastiest form of architecture and urban design out on the urban fringe. And surprise, surprise, those residents who are coerced or forced into taking an apartment that may indeed have a bathroom but doesn't have a livelihood, they will move out of that, probably sublet it and move back into another informal settlement because that's in their interest to do so. We have to break out of that cycle of thinking that this problem can be fixed in that top-down way. We need to work with these communities to upgrade the settlements that they have already invested in.
Kim, we have 10 minutes left. And there's still a number of questions. So I would like you to maybe choose a couple of them that can be answered in 10 minutes. I'm so sorry to all the participants for the interest, but
I'm going to read the questions out and then I'll make a choice. Okay?
Yeah, sure.
What if morphogenesis approach is applied in areas with mountain slope topography? I should say that a morphogenesis approach is really it's a research approach. It applies anywhere. The issues with regard to mountain slope topography is the same as anywhere else. So often I hear the argument that these settlements have to be removed because they're in a flood zone, or they've built out over the water, or they're built on marshy ground and it's unstable, or they're on steep slopes and the ground is unstable, and so on. The rich build in those locations all the time. And they do it by investing in stabilization strategies. And floods, that there are ways of alleviating flood danger and so on. So I don't think, I just think that the same kind of principles need to apply to the informal settlements as apply in the formal city. How often do you find an informal settlement being forcibly evicted and demolished on the basis that it was a flood risk, and then some neoliberal global capitalist development project emerges on the same site simply because they've been able to invest in the flood mitigation measures that are necessary. If those measures are possible, then they are possible for the informal settlement. Could you elaborate why increased organization brings lower permeability? My assumption is the better organized people will be easier for them to organize better accessibility and permeability. Another good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to this, but the best go I could have at it is that the kind of tragedy of the commons that I talked about, of course, that links to that very famous argument by Harden about private interest trumping public interest, about which there's a lot of contention and debate. And of course, the counter arguments from people like Ostrom, who have argued that informal self-organized systems can overcome and do not inevitably succumb to the tragedy of the commons. I see the hyper impermeability that sometimes emerges, like in the Cairo case, as a kind of a tragedy of the commons. There just is no larger, the level of organization here is one apartment building at a time. And since there is no personal interest in adding extra street space, it just doesn't get, it simply doesn't happen. I don't have a full answer as to why that might be the case, but I do know that this is not particularly uncommon, but it's also not uncommon in the formal city. You know, the many development practices in the formal city these days produce large impermeable barriers to human movement in the middle of the city, and planners somehow approve these projects. So in my view, it's a lack of planning in both cases. Planning requires permeability. We know that from Jane Jacobs onwards. Every sensible traditional city, it was simply embodied that you needed, for walkability, you needed to have permeability. I just think that nobody in that particular example was taking the larger view of the public interest. So that there is a, when I say these settlements are planned, I don't mean they're well planned. When I say they're designed, I don't mean they're well designed. When I call the buildings architecture, it doesn't mean that they are high architecture. The next one says, thank you for the very interesting research and presentation. Short question, how do you see the sustainability of informal urban design, especially in big cities, as an opportunity, since many precedents show its strong connection with low urban quality living in many ways, infrastructure, health, crime, etc. Sustainability is one of these big words that I tend to try to avoid because it's such a big word. Well, it can mean anything. Economic sustainability, social sustainability, environmental sustainability. So I'll take it as all of those. One thing I would say is that in terms of environmental sustainability, I think that informal settlements are very low emitters, that much of the urban design thinking in the formal city and in rich cities is trying to direct urban design practices towards small scale but high density, walkable, highly permeable, mixed use neighborhoods that are not car dependent and that are well connected into the city and its job opportunities. Now, that is also a description of many informal settlements, which are high density, low rise, walkable, often completely inaccessible to cars, often built out of recycled materials, so very, very low energy. In many ways, I think that if we get serious about the upgrading of informal settlements in a global sense, and we're successful, that will increase the emissions simply because the current impact, the environmental impact of the informal settlements is really very low. Now, a lot of people might scoff at that and say, oh, just think of all of the pollution and the rubbish and so on. But I think that you need to take that larger picture, and that there is something relatively environmentally sustainable about them. I think in terms of economic sustainability, I made the case earlier that these people run the city. Without informal transport, without informal trading, how do you think these cities would work? You take that out, you're taking out, sometimes some estimates say half of the retailing. You're taking out nearly all of the affordable housing. The city cannot function without that. So in terms of that kind of economic sustainability, I think that they're crucial. I think socially, it is more problematic. Some informal settlements escalate into crime conditions, and that's largely because the control of the state often doesn't penetrate into the informal settlements. And various kinds of mafia groups do penetrate into informal settlements. This is a serious issue. It's a different kind of organization. You get a kind of in some areas, a kind of a quasi-state operating within the informal settlements and controlling development and controlling public space and extracting profit, indeed, from informal settlements. This is a serious worry. It needs to be stopped. So I would say they're sustainable in some ways, and I'd say they're deeply unsustainable in other ways. This is a piece of the challenge. I don't really want to pretend that I know that much about a lot of that. It's in order to get a handle on any part of how these settlements work, I think you need to focus on where the area of expertise is, and mine happens to be in urban design and planning and architecture. Thank you for sharing your research. From your perspective, what is the main factor that contributes in generating an informal settlement? What generates them? And what's your suggestion regarding the opportunities for developing the socioeconomic condition for the people who live there? What's generating them is, again, those economic conditions. But to say that the conditions, that the larger global economic conditions are effective, or global inequality, which has just massively expanded, that produces rural to urban migration. This is not something that is a kind of a choice that people are making. So the massive rural to urban migration has been going on for a long time, and it's going to continue for a long time. And it's partly because cities are the engines of the global economy. Cities are where the jobs and the ideas are being produced. We have moved from agricultural and extraction economy and from towards a knowledge economy, and as that continues, so will this kind of movement. I don't see that stopping. That's what's producing this. But as I said before, any attempt to reduce this to some kind of, well, it's all about global capitalism, therefore we'll just go and stage a revolution and solve it or something, I think that is complete nonsense. These settlements are there to stay, and they are the major assets of the urban poor, and engaging with this problem is really the only way forward, even though I think that the attempts to get global change are really, in terms of economic inequality, are fundamentally important too. If we could really address the problems of global inequality, then that would make a huge difference. It would mean that the state, in many of the poorer countries, the state would have half a chance of being able to deal with the problem, of having the resources to deal with it, even if it didn't have the will. But I think that I'm not sure how much more I can say about that. I don't have the answers to some of this. There's no easy way forward from here. That the only thing that I'm saying is that we need to learn a lot more about how this works, and that those professionals who are going to engage in these issues, and this is going to be the big growing market. You know, if you're a young planner, urban designer, architect, this is the big emerging market. If you have some ideas about how to gain some real ground here, then this is the big opportunity. I've read many of your books and triggered personal question. You have acknowledged as urban design theorist. In contrast, not many architectural or urban design students like theory. They prefer to learn by practicing, trial and error. Based on your experience, how to bring theories more familiar to architecture students so they need not be afraid of theory as their learning matter? I don't understand why people don't like theory. You know, one of my favorite sayings is that there's nothing so practical as a good theory. You know, a theory is, there's the other saying. People say, oh, well, that's all well in theory, but what about in practice? It strikes me that a theory that is not practical is not a good theory. The idea that theory is an end in itself, that somehow we're just, it seems to me wrong. I'm doing this research as, to me, it's a theoretical exercise. I want to build theory about how informal settlement works. I said I wasn't going to do a theory lecture, but in a sense, this is a theory lecture, because theory is about ideas, and ideas are about concepts and the ways in which people think. If people prefer to be, when you say just by trial and error, or go out and, but everybody, it strikes me, has a theory. The people who say, oh, I don't like theory, I just like practice. I just do it by trial and error. I learn on the street. People who learn on the street, and the street is a very good place to learn. The street is a very good school. If you if you know how to open your eyes and to look, you know, I mean, you look at someone like Jane Jacobs, the great Jane Jacobs, the greatest urbanist we've ever seen, I think. For her, the street was the school. That, you know, she didn't go to architecture school. She didn't get this from university. She got it by looking at cities. Others, Richard Sennett, lots of people, you know, great urbanists. That's where they learn. That's where I learn. It's why I like traveling, because you learn so much, and you learn on the street. You look, you ask questions, you talk to people. Sure, you learn other stuff from books, but you learn from the city. And so people who say that they just want to practice, they don't really want to think about theory. Are they saying they don't want to learn? Trial and error is a learning process. But as soon as you try something, you are implementing a theory. And if your theory is that informal settlements are bad and need to be demolished, then what do? You go ahead, your trial is you demolish the informal settlement. You find that all of those people go and start another settlement somewhere else. Well, there's your error. What do we learn from that? You know, that's, I mean, I'm not opposed to trial and error, but people who think they don't have a theory are often the most ignorant people around. I really appreciate your research. I just ask, is it important to counter-check the graphical result with the real-life condition of habitation of each area? The graphical result is that we've presented in the maps is really just a morphological map. And sure, you need to check that with the, if you like, the condition of habitation. But we are not, this is not a study of slums. We are not judging these settlements according to the conditions of habitation. I think we're out of time, Wing.
Yes, you already answered all of the questions. That was the last question. So thank you very much, Kim, for the lovely presentations. I think what Kim has just presented and his long interest in researching urban informal settlements is I don't know, a kind of wake-up call to us here in Indonesia, because he lives in a predominantly formal environment, but pays a great interest in this field. I don't know if it is a correct analogy. It's like a listening gamelan orchestra played by an Australian. You know what I mean? Sorry, this is just a joke, right? Sometimes we listen to, you know, there's a lot of things that we missed simply because this is part of our everyday experience, and we just, you know, ignore it. So I hope this presentation can be, I mean, like, we can continue this as a part of a network of informal urbanism study. And thank you to all the participants who has joined this event. I did not expect to have this many participants because I thought the subject is not, you know, a mainstream. So this is part of the challenge. How can we strengthen this study and put this as part of the, I would say, core of the architectural educations, right? Let us give virtual applause to Kim. Thank you very much. All right, and I'm so sorry.
Very much for coming along.
Right, and sorry if I cannot take questions anymore. And thank you again, and we'll see you again in the next webinar. So I have to end this webinar. So yeah, hopefully we can inform you similar topics of this research.
Thanks, Wing.
In the next webinar. Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.